Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'm going to be speaking to is to speak about some of the ways in which we've been thinking about what approaches need to happen, need to take place for us to get to this process of the rebalancing that we're speaking of. We've already spoken about the importance of international research collaborations, that much of the research that is conducted within the African continent, it is in collaboration with colleagues and other institutions that are outside of the continent. And therefore, it's important that we start looking at research collaborations as an entry point. These collaborations offer us an entry point. So it's important for us, therefore, to rethink the ways in which these collaborations happen. If we use and leverage the collaborations that are already in place and possible collaborations in future, we can then leverage on this to think about rethinking, but also advancing and reimagining the ways in which these collaborations happen. So collaborations have the potential to be transformative, but we need to rethink how this happens. So the transformation is critical for this work to happen. So a transformative mode, therefore, of research collaborations is our starting point in thinking about how do we rebalance the global knowledge system, ecosystem, in thinking about the ways in which knowledge is produced. And here I would like to revert back a little bit to what Isabella spoke about in how we're thinking about this, that we're thinking about this as a concentric circle. And we see the challenges happening at all these different layers. And so we need to pay close attention to these layers and rethink the ways in which we engage with each other at all these different and multiple layers. The first one being at epistemology level. We need to critique and trouble the hegemony of Western knowledge frameworks in the production of scientific knowledge. What does that do in terms of what kind of knowledge gets produced? And here again, we need to go back to history and the colonial legacies in terms of determining what knowledge gets privileged when it comes to scientific knowledge. We have a long history of epistemic violence, and this shows itself also in the kinds of collaborations that we have with each other. So African ways of being, other knowledge systems are often relegated to the periphery, and this assumption of the Euro-Western ways of knowing and being central, being the norm, is something that we need to think about and critique. In our collaboration endeavors, it's something that we need to center. And of course, language is important. And sometimes we take it for granted. We speak about rankings, we speak about different databases that we use to determine these rankings, and what kind of outputs, what languages I use. So if I publish in a language that is not a Western language or that is not English, will that make its way into the citations, into the rankings? So it's also important to also think about the importance of language. And of course, this is directly linked to the idea of epistemic violence. So epistemologies, violence are interlinked in terms of how we think about language. So when we speak about rebalancing, we also need to speak about the language in the knowledge production systems that we use. And then, of course, our theories, our concepts, what Pauline Hutunji calls extraversion, right? There is this default use of Western theories that are often assumed to be the core and the lens that we use to make meaning, to understand, and use as our focus in the work that we do. So these theories and concepts are used to understand how the world, including Africa, works, and a resultant orientation that we often have towards the West is often assumed as the rightful site of scientific knowledge production. So there again, if we're thinking about approaches going forward, this is something that we also need to rethink as well. We should not continue to take these for granted and think about their implications when we sit together and think about coming and doing collaborations together. What concepts, what theories, how are these going to show themselves in the collaborations that we have with each other? And of course, the developmental gaze. When we look and think about development, Africa, as we know, is always understood as developing, perpetually developing, right? As a site of deficits that need to catch up with the Western modern advancement. So again, the unidirectional, it's always from the top to the bottom. Africa has to be developed. So we need to think, to change and reframe that narrative, because it also speaks to the kind of research that we do. Much of the research that's done focuses on health. It's health issues and health challenges within the African continent. We don't center innovative, technological, forward-looking engineering things. And also when we're thinking about development, it also speaks to funding. Where is funding going? Most of the work, most of the funding goes towards health. So when we rethink and trouble this idea of development in Africa as developing, that can also speak again to the kinds of research that we do. There are many ideas, many innovations, advancements. Astronomy in Africa is that often at the core. And if we don't have it as the core, then this perpetual idea of Africa as this child that's always developing but never gets to a point where it's developed becomes a challenge. And then the resourcing capabilities of higher education. And here again, Prof. Mutanga, go back to your opening remarks yesterday when you were speaking about where are the resources going. If we're saying there's insufficient resourcing, what does that mean when it comes to the kinds of research that we do? Prof. Mutanga reminded us yesterday that much of the resources go to basic education. So higher education does not often get sufficient funding. So this then is a challenge that speaks to what kind of research can we do, and also what voice we can have when it comes to research collaborations that we put in place. So there needs to be resources that allow for long-term sustainable projects, not a project that's 1 year, 3 years, and then it ends. So for sustainability, resourcing is very, very critical. And then, of course, the practical collaboration arrangements are very important. Who's going to be the lead? Where is the project going to be based? Are these some of the conversations that we often center in our engagements in the work that we're doing? So these are the layers that we deem are very critical for us and can assist us as a starting point in terms of conversations that we need to have when we're talking about research collaborations. It should move beyond who's going to be the lead author, right? Who's going to be holding the funding, but fundamentally at the epistemic theory concept level, how are collaborations going to be framed if we take these issues seriously? And then second and last, establishing transformative collaboration mode needs to be done as best and standard practice. And this happens at different levels as well. There needs to be change from the individual perspective. So individual consciousness and capabilities also need to be given attention and support. So change needs to happen at our individual as researchers, at our consciousness in terms of how we approach the research and research collaborations that we conduct with each other. And then, do we have shared norms in the kinds of work that we're doing, in the collaborations that we do with each other. How do we get to a point where there are shared norms, where there isn't this imbalance that we're speaking about? And then, of course, the resource streams. I've spoken about that already, that work cannot happen if there are no resources in space. So change needs to also happen at the resource level. There has to be an openness and a willingness to ensure that there's resources in place for research work to happen. And of course, policy and regulatory frameworks are very critical. What we're speaking about is not only for academic institutions, but we also understand that academic institutions do not operate in silos. So it's higher education institutions, but it's also the funders that are very critical in the success of each and every project. So when we talk about the imbalances and the change that needs to happen, this conversation also needs to happen with the funders as well, because change also needs to happen there as well. And then assessment bodies, how do we do our assessment? How do we determine quality, and how do we determine all the rankings? We've already said they are very problematic. How can that be done differently? And then our governments are very important when it comes to issues around policies, policy building, policy changing. This work will not be possible if all these various stakeholders are not working hand in hand in our rethinking of the research ecosystem. And with that, we're going to move to the last part where we're talking about the relevance of all of this for Africa and the global community. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Divan.